if you want to be a great developer, if you want to be a 10x Spring Boot developer, there's certain configurations that you really need to include in your application.properties file that'll make software development a lot more enjoyable. Now, I want to just state from the outset, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different settings that you can make to your application.properties file or application.yaml file. I don't discriminate. But right here, I just want to concentrate specifically on the settings that will make your life easier as a software developer. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com. And whenever I'm doing pair programming or someone's troubleshooting over my shoulder, they often ask me, hey, how come your environment does that? Or how did you get it to do this other thing? And I always say to them, hey, it's just a couple of settings into your application properties file, and things will actually work a lot better if you do that. And showing you what those changes are that I typically make to my own personal environment, that's what I'm going to go over next. Okay, the very first application property that we have to talk about is just the server port. It's a standard Spring Boot interview question. How do you change the server port? And it's something that as a developer you need to do. I've got a simple Spring Boot RESTful web application running here. It's got a simple endpoint / health check. And if I run this application and I bring up my browser on port 8080, you can see 8080 in the console window there. And I open this up, click enter. You can see that, well, it says situation normal, all fired up, which is what the word snafu means, by the way, just in case you didn't know. A Christian version of it anyways. And every time this runs, line 18 prints out a simple console message, just letting us know that we actually got into the message, seeing that the output to the browser is always the same. Now, if you've got Jenkins running on port 8080, you don't want to use that port. So what you do is you do this. You simply say server.port. I'm going to set it to 80, and I'm the greatest hockey player of all time, Mario Lemieux. Then I can come back and restart this application. And when I restart this application, it starts up on port 8066. Now, in fact, you can actually see it already running on port 8066 because just as soon as I made a change to my application, all of a sudden the Spring Boot rebooted my application and started it up on port 8066, which I find incredibly annoying. Sometimes I wish there was a way I could change it, but I got to deal with the way Spring Boot is. And so now I go 8066 and it works. Now, by the way, we didn't stop 8088, 8080. So, I mean, that one's working. Oh, it looks like we did stop 8080. 8080 is no longer running. So we are now running on port 8066. We have changed the port of the server. So that's how easy it is to do. Now, I did mention I really dislike the fact that Spring Boot restarts every single time I make a change, right? Like I might just go over here and say simple console message in, click save, and then down at the bottom, notice it just changed again, like I did a reboot, like just because I made a change and then click save. So in properties, right? Like I don't need a redeploy here. I just made a simple, but boom, it redeploys again. So that tends to annoy me. And a lot of times I'll go into a web application, and as I'm in the web application, I might just be doing some tidying up. I might just be doing some documentation. And I'm not constantly testing it. So one of the things you can do to just stop that is you throw this into your properties file. You head over to your properties file, and instead of saying spring devtools restart enabled equals true, you could set that to false. And as soon as you do that, it restarts, ironically, because I made a change. But now that I've made a change, it's not going to restart again. So over here, simple, I'll make this the very simple console message. Control S. How long do you want to wait around? It's not restarting, right? So, I don't know, pretty cool. Sometimes that's helpful, right? Just stop it from restarting, consuming resources, constantly going to the console window. Now, there is some balance that you might want to strike. So instead of turning it off completely, what you could do is you could set an interval on which Spring Boot will poll for changes. So maybe instead of every 2 seconds looking to see if something's changed, you can set it to 60 seconds. And then that way, Okay, it's not constantly restarting, but every minute or so, it'll take your changes, redeploy them. You can actually figure out what's working. So there you go. That is an option for you. Now, another thing that annoys me is all of the logs here. So to me, this isn't helpful. All of this crazy logging here. I don't need to know today's dates. I don't need to know the application's name. I don't need to know all this stuff. Oh, by the way, notice the application name. That's my YAML name. This is worth mentioning. When you develop an application, you can use either properties or a YAML file. And so here I've got spring application name, my YAML name, that's the name of the property. And by default, when Spring does logging, it prints out your application's name. So that's a good property to set. Now, we can also set that in the application.properties file. And I think that's actually a good thing to set. And I'll call that my 10x app demo. Right? So that'll now be the name of my application. And watch this as I restart. The red and green will do a restart of this application. Now when I restart this application, notice that the name is my 10x app demo. So previously it was pulling from the YAML file, but you can use YAML and property files together. The only thing you need to know is that when you do, the properties file is actually going to overwrite what's in the YAML file. But putting the application name in there is interesting, it's useful. And as you can see by default, Spring Boot will print out the application name. And in fact, when you create a Spring Boot application, it includes spring.application.name anyways, but it's a kind of a cool one. It's worth mentioning. But to be honest with you, when I'm doing local development, if this is going to the server, fine, print out the application name, print out the year and the month. I don't need to know the year. I'm pretty sure that, the code I'm writing is done in 2024. I don't need the year or the month or even the day in my local environment. All I want to see is really just the logs. So here's another important setting. Just change the pattern for the console logs, right? We don't need all of that crazy, nutty information up there. And so here I'm going to just restart this web app because the polling interview is too darn long. But now look at the console output. It's a lot nicer. Okay, just the date, the log level info, and then all of the messages that comes after that. It's not all bloated. And then when you start doing your own logging, it looks really good. It becomes a lot easier to look at. Now, I will say, you might want to get rid of just all of the info messages from Spring Boot. There's a few ways to do that. But you can set the logging threshold for the console to warn. And when you set the logging threshold to the console to warn, what will happen is you're not going to see any log levels that is below warn. So I'm going to set that, make that change, open up my web app. Now, by the way, you can actually configure the level for different packages. So you could say that anything that's org.spring only allow warn, but anything that is com.mcnz.spring, that's my package, print out anything that is info or higher. So you can actually go right down to the package level, but here we're just going to say warn. And now when the application starts up, hardly prints out anything. I can actually bring up my application. There's the health check there. And look at that. Look at how easy this is now to just troubleshoot my own code. I don't have all of that junk. I don't have all that garbage. I don't have restarting constantly. Like it's just making life so much better for me. Even that banner I can do without. So, I mean, here's one. We could just whittle this down to practically nothing. Spring main banner mode off. I sometimes feel that Spring banner that comes up is mocking me. It's kind of like when things aren't working, it's like, yeah, here's Spring. You can't do it. So let's just turn that off. Now let's restart the application, start the web app. Now we're not going to get any information at all when this thing starts up. This might be a little extreme here, but it emphasizes the point. Well, let's open up our application. Let's see what happens when we go to good old port Mario Lemieux. Now we've got some output there in the console. That might be a little little brief. But nevertheless, it emphasizes the point. Like customizing your logs. Like, I mean, how much time do we spend in the logs? If you're troubleshooting your own code like I am all the time, a lot, right? And so if you can make your life a bit easier while you're digging around in these log files, well, your life is going to be a whole lot easier. Okay. Now, turning the banner completely off might not be the right thing. Instead of turning it off, so, oh, by the way, one other thing, just a hash sign there gets rid of a particular entry, so you can comment things out with an octothorpe. Instead of using the default banner, you can point to any file on your file system with Spring banner location. Here I'm going to say I'm going to open up my banner.txt. And there's my banner.txt. It says, I love Java. And now when Java restarts, and it just did, I now get this coming up. So no longer Spring mocking me. Now Java is mocking me. I love Java. The ASCII art that I took from an online website, I'll link to it in the description. Somebody's got something there to help you generate ASCII art for Spring Boot, which is kind of funny. Thank you for that. That's where I copied it from. But less important than the crazy ASCII art, which, I'll go into this banner here. I can delete that. I don't really need that. But it is kind of cool. Is this, right? At the beginning of your banner, you can include information about your environment. The application name is helpful. I don't like that in my logs, but because I'm probably only working on one application at a time. But printing it out at the top of the log is helpful. Also, if you're working with profiles, I got a full tutorial on how to use Spring profiles, a key part of doing Spring development. If you're using different profiles, like a profile for prod, a profile for dev, a profile for UAT, it's good to know as you start troubleshooting what profile you're in. Because, I mean, if things aren't working and you see right away, oh, I'm actually in the wrong profile, it should be in dev, but for some reason it's set to prod, like that tells you right away. So I like to display what profile I'm in, then maybe the Spring Boot version. And you can put any of the Spring properties here that are valid and print that out to give you some of your own information. And so that all looks good to me. Now, notice that when it printed out last time, it just said spring.profiles.active. Sometimes you can put a default value in here. I don't know if that will work. Let me restart the application. But rather than putting that default value in there, hey, actually look at that, it actually worked. You should actually be using Spring profiles. So in your application properties file, normally you would be using a profile, like a dev profile that would list all of the databases that you're using in dev, which are going to be different from the database URLs and credentials in production. And then when you would rerun this application, you'd actually see that it's going to say active profile is dev. And again, that can be super, super helpful. And then that actually just kind of introduces us to another couple of annotations: Spring boot.version, Spring profiles.active, spring.application.name. All important properties to be adding in there. Okay, another important property, I don't have this on all the time, but I do like to have it on, is debug equals true. And debug equals true. Now, in order for this to work, I think I got to set the logging threshold just to info. I'm going to play around with that just a little bit. But I'm going to restart my application with debug equal true on. I hope there's no other settings there that are going to mess this up. But I'm going to restart, take a look at what happens here, and look at all of this information that gets printed out. So I think, kind of what's down here is probably most of what normally gets printed. But what debug equals true does is it prints out every single component that could possibly be auto-configured in your environment. If there's a positive match, Spring Boot is auto-configuring it. If there's a negative match, you can scroll down and find negative matches. There you go, negative matches. Those are things that aren't being auto-configured, and I think there's some stuff that's just by default always auto-configured, so unconditional classes and exclusions. But if you're having a problem or something isn't working properly, or you just want to configure something, you want to know how to configure it, you can come in here. And so not only does this tell you what is being auto-configured, but it tells you the values to use to turn it off. So right here, you can see that auto configuration for aspect-oriented programming, AOP, is enabled. Well, maybe you don't want AOP enabled. So I'll copy spring.aop auto equals true, head over to my application properties and set it to false. Reboot the application with the red square and green triangle. And I'm going to get this whole printout here. As I said, I don't know if I want this every time, but I mean, it just goes off once. And you can see no longer is aspect-oriented programming a positive match. It's no longer being auto-configured, right? And we can see it down there. AOP auto configuration, the second entry under negative matches. And it says that indeed, that is not being turned on. So if you wanted it to be turned on, you're going to have to go and do it yourself. Okay, so those are some of the key configurations that I would do. Now, here's another that I think is pretty important. I'll see if I've got that in my environment here. I'm kind of going off the beaten path here. But one of the important configurations too, especially when you're working with properties files, is being able to go from your default property files in Spring and the application properties file and reference some other property file, right? Because you actually don't want to fill up the application properties files with all sorts of junk. So I've got an example here. This is from a tutorial on application properties and something else. I think YAML versus property files for application properties. And what I've got here is I've got a listing of all of my favorite things, right? So I think I polluted it with some of that stuff there, but let's just pretend that's not there, right? But you know, I've got some properties that I want to use. These are all my favorite things, my favorite city, my favorite food, my favorite attractions. Now, all of this favorite data, well, you know, I don't want that in application properties. So it's a good idea to create a separate file. I recommend YAML, but it could be just a regular property file as well. And then the ability to say in your application file, hey, when you load, also load that other file and make those properties available globally. That can be exceptionally helpful to you. Another thing I would mention as well, and you can see it right here, when you're actually working with different profiles like dev and prod and pre-prod, you usually have different property files. So you might have application.dev.properties or application.prod.properties. Look at this. You can actually now put them all in one file. And this has been around for a few years, but a lot of people aren't aware of that. This one file gives me the default application properties. So everything above this octothorpe and 3 dashes is just what is part of the regular application.properties. Everything below it is part of the active profile for dev. So if we're actually running in dev mode, if the spring.config.activate.on profile equals dev, then the settings underneath the octothorpe and 3 dashes get included. So that's essentially the same as application-dev.properties. Now you can do that in your properties file. You can also do it in a YAML file as well. The YAML file, there's no octothorpe. It's just the 3 dashes. But above those 3 dashes is the configuration for what would just be normal application.yaml. Below, that's configuration specifically for the dev profile. So those are pretty cool as well. Now, I think I'm running out of things to mention. And a couple of others that I will mention. I'm not going to demo these. I demo them in a couple of other tutorials that I have, and they're more specific to a technology. But one I would say is for Tomcat, we looked at server port. Server tomcat.max HTTP form post size. It's limited to 2 megs, I believe. You usually want to bump that up, especially for testing. So that'll make your life a lot easier. For JSON output, there is spring.jackson.serialization.indent-output. That's going to pretty up any JSON that you print out when you're using Jackson. So that is a solid one to use. When you're using Hibernate, if you want to drop the database and recreate a new database with your Hibernate configuration every time you stop and start the application, which is really helpful for testing, there is spring.jpa.hibernate.dll spring.auto. So that automatically drops and creates the database in your environment each time the application starts up. That's really helpful for development. Maybe even more is spring.jpa.show-sql. That allows you to see the SQL that gets created behind the scenes when a JPA query or a JPA operation happens. And sometimes that can be helpful to get an understanding of what's going on. So it's just interesting to see what the SQL is that's empowering your ORM model. And then, of course, start thinking about using virtual threads. Spring.threads.virtual.enabled. It allows you to enable virtual threads, and that just might help you take advantage of all of those idle cores on your computer. Okay, there you go. That was way more than 10. As I said, the 10 number is just clickbait. There's closer to 20 different settings, but hopefully you just kind of got an idea of some of the things you can do to really configure your own environment and make the experience just a little bit more pleasurable as you're going through code, going through the logs, improving features, doing a little bit of troubleshooting, and debugging some of your code. Okay, that's it. I'm done for now. If you enjoyed that, why don't you head over to the serverside.com. I am the editor-in-chief over there with lots of great tutorials on Spring, Spring Boot, Java, GitHub, Git, Docker, DevOps, you name it. If you're interested in my personal antics, you can always follow me on Twitter at CameronMCNZ. And of course, I do have a few books behind me. Pickering of Springfield, all about The Simpsons. What is WebSphere? Java certification book. I also Darcy DeClute Scrumptious on Twitter, her Scrum Master certification guide. I use that to pass both the PSM1 and PSM2 certification exams. I did do help with a little final edits on that as well. A lot of people are purchasing that book and scoring 100% in the Scrum Master exam. So if you're agile and working with Scrum and you want to improve your career, definitely pick that up. And then finally, if you're watching this on YouTube, why don't you subscribe on the YouTube?